capture meetings and stuff. So how are you, Josh?
Doing well.
Good.
We're getting some sun over here. Weather's warming up a little bit. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
good, good. All right. Well, Chris and I were just reminiscing on a couple of older assignments, and now I think we are ready to dive in. I am recording, but Josh, if you want to, or anybody else wants to record for backup, we did need the backup last time Josh and I were together. So
Okay.
I am recording as well.
Okay. Then I'll trust you guys then.
I'm approving. Perfect. All right. Well, we ready to get started?
Sure.
Okay.
Ready.
Perfect. All right, so this is really mostly on chapter 6, and we were focusing on the four components of rating a qualitative study: reflex, reflex, reflexivity and representation, audience, encoding, and quotes. Which two appendices did you choose, or did you choose different readings this time?
I personally chose different readings.
Okay.
But they were readings that we had done in another assignment, but I was already familiar with them.
Okay.
And part of it was they were honestly, they were easier to kind of go through these than the appendix. The one I had done before was the ethnography, right, with the study of the young men in Britain of Pakistani and
Bangladesh.
yeah, Bangladeshi descent. So, because the way those are written, it kind of, this is actually a good uh, uh, way to contrast the two. So, the two articles that I had done were basically written for educators. So, the audience is educational leadership, and one was basically the what were the effects of any, if any, of COVID during the on historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, on them because there was a number of studies on the effects of it seemed like every place else, but at the time this was done, there was never a focus on just those schools. And so that research study was actually very clean. I mean, he wrote the representation, let me toggle over to my notes right here. He basically said, "This is who I am." You know, uh, I am a leader at a HBCU. I never attended one, but the point of this is basically to get an understanding of how it was designed. And he was very clear. This is why I'm going about it. So it was specified, nice little area. I thought, okay, this is cool. The next one, not so much. And
Mm.
so that one was basically the effects of online learning to uh, non-traditional students, but students that were 25 years or older. So, of all of the studies of non-traditional students, this was a particular group, kind of like working adults, that never was really scrutinized
Okay.
for it, is or studied in this way. So,
Mhm.
but that study, that author did not really go through and say, give much of their opinion on anything or where they were coming from. It was much more, I'm going to use the term clinical about it. In fact, it wasn't even till this is probably about a 13 page, study. And the word I never showed up till probably halfway through.
Where did you say you found those articles? Or were they in
Those,
journals?
yeah, through Ferris, the flight library.
So one of the interesting things that I read that I hadn't ever really considered before was that sometimes when studies are published in articles, they have to meet certain parameters like length. So I'm
Mm.
wondering if it's possible with any of these, if maybe some of the reflexivity did come up, but because of it probably didn't, Chris, because you read it,
Sure.
the tone, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, how much are we missing? What are we missing when we're reading journal articles versus whole
Well,
population.
I never even knew that, so I wouldn't know if we were missing anything. I wouldn't be expecting anything more.
Right, right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, yeah, that was something that I just learned reading through. So I would be very curious. I stuck to the appendices and I really only saw one very clear example. I don't know, Josh, if you did as well, but I only saw really one clear example where the author really talked about like bridling and
Mhm.
really made it clear that so that I'm referring to appendices B, or appendix B, and the author talked about how she was a Black woman in higher education, and she talked about what she did to remove her biases out of the um out of the study, or she talked about different ways in which she combated it. So I thought that that was very clear in comparison to what you seem to experience, Chris, where you didn't really see that at all.
Yeah, no, like I said, the one was very much, and these were about, I don't know, kind of after effects of something else. These weren't necessarily a, um, and I can't think of the words, but some of the studies are about improving something necessarily, or a particular group that's being adversely impacted by something. These are just in a different way, looking at there's nothing necessarily societal about it. It was just, okay, this particular group, how do these things affect them?
Mhm.
Not necessarily, you know, uh, overtly discriminatory based on some culture or whatever. It's just more of a maybe I guess disparate treatment,
Mhm.
if anything. So maybe the tone of that. Um, but um, but the audience definitely was educational leaders, higher ed specifically. And then the encoding, if I get it right, would be kind of the language that's used, the acronyms, and that was definitely geared towards higher ed. I'm like, because I picked up on that when I was reading the case. I think it was case in the appendix D, the ethnography. The whole language is different. It was written to people much smarter than me, and you
I'm
know,
so glad you said that because I compared B and D, and when I was
Mhm.
reading D, I had to keep looking up words
yes,
because I didn't understand things. And,
yeah,
and that's one of the things that I kept thinking. Josh, and I want to make sure that we're giving you a chance to speak too.
yeah,
That was one of the things that I kept thinking was I am losing what this is talking about because I can't even understand half the words in here, you know?
yeah. Yeah,
So
so yeah, you're not alone, but there was a big difference between the encoding, if you will. I was like, okay, this is not towards that Appendix D was not written to a higher ed bean counter. It was it was written for people that are probably much more into research, sociological research, and are into that stuff.
I wondered if it was really geared towards sociologists and anthropologists, maybe
Yeah,
cultural
Mhm.
anthropologists. Josh, what'd you read?
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We'll be quiet now.
Well, no, Chris, it's interesting that, you said like you read one article and it was great and it went through all the parts, and then you read a second article and it was like, this is a lot more difficult to navigate. I had a very similar experience. So I read two articles that are of interest to me because it's something I think I want to do my dissertation on. So the first one was a phenomenological study about the lived experiences of higher ed professionals who are addressing food insecurity on their campus. And so
Right.
it was the researcher started out with the studies basically saying that they're a lifelong chef, they love food, they're a researcher, they've done this research, they're an educator, right? So they're bringing that with them to the study. They stated specifically that they believe access to culturally appropriated food and other basic needs is a fundamental human right. So specifically stating like, this is where I'm coming from, these are my beliefs, these are my experiences. And that was like, so it was like the first paragraph. And so it was very clear where this person was coming from. The second article that I read was about exploring the barriers of use of community food resources in community college students in rural Appalachia. Very difficult to find. There was not one specific section about reflexivity, but let's see, in the procedures section, they had talked about um, that they've done this research before, specifically in Kentucky. They've taught at Kentucky University for decades. They're a lifelong native to rural Appalachia. They were born in the county that the study is about. And so it was interesting because they were talking more about building trustworthiness with the participants, is like I had this experience. So it wasn't even necessarily talking about reflexivity. And then there was a second analysis section or a brief like sentence, and it just said the researcher purposely bracketed her perceptions of food insecurity from previous studies so it didn't influence this one. So very brief, and I had to go searching for it.
Yep.
Um,
Your ethnography is very similar to my ethnography, where I had to go
mhm,
searching. And
mhm,
what it translated to me is that, and kind of what I was starting to feel when you were listing off some of the things that they said, was that it was almost kind of like a cred. Like I have
mhm,
cred because and that's
yeah,
the way that I'm like making sense of the words, right? But like
yeah,
the what the heck was the name of the appendix D? They talked about how their snowballing technique was enabled by the fact that they were committed to bettering the community, the local community.
mhm,
So it was clear to me that they were known in some capacity, but I never read, were they Pakistani? Were they British? Were British born? Were they Bangladeshi? Like I didn't make that connection. I also went searching for it. So we have some
mhm,
similarities there.
I wonder if, when I'm listening, if, and this might not qualify as reflexivity, but there has to be some sort of interest by the author or the researcher to actually conduct the research that they're doing. So that does
mhm,
say something a little bit about their thought processes. I mean, that these are important topics to them. There's a reason why
mhm.
they picked it. I can't imagine them wanting to spend the time on something they're not interested in for some sort of reason. But, that, but whether or not they specifically say, and again, I will say it is very one thing I've had to wrap my head around with qualitative research is that you do include opinions and things like that. When we've been trained, especially as an accountant with audits, you're trying to be very
Yeah.
objective and sterile and trying to let the data come to you so you can do it. This is a very different way of thinking. So, um,
Mhm.
to not have the stuff in the report would see, or in the study would be what I would
Yeah.
be used to, right? So,
Encouraged even,
Well,
yeah.
and I think it helps the reader better understand the bigger picture,
yeah.
understanding who the researcher is. I think specifically with that second study where it talked about like they grew up in the area, they're familiar with the work. Um, the work is, or the research was all about community food resources, right? So it was very community focused. And the fact that this researcher was part of a community, has experience doing it, I think lends itself well to doing the work. Um,
Sure.
it is interesting though, like I said, I had to go and search for it. But when we talk about the audience, so it was in the Journal of Hunger and Environmental Nutrition. Um, let's see, it was funded by the Aetna Foundation, which is a part of CBS.
Yep.
But their big mission is supporting healthy communities, right? So I think the language of the study was very much geared towards anybody could pick this up and read it because we want everyone in a community to feel like they're part of the work. Whereas the first study was very much so, I'm talking to higher ed professionals, I'm referencing higher ed literature. This is very much for folks in higher ed and potentially policymakers making decisions that influence higher ed. But I feel like knowing what journal it's in, I think helped me understand what the language was, or who the audience was. But I think some of that came from the reflexivity. Who is this? What's their interest and what's
Yeah.
their purpose of the study?
Yeah, I think
Definitely feel more comfortable navigating these studies now that we've gone through this book.
yeah, this has been a good exercise for me going through and kind of decompressing each chapter. Um,
Well, and now I know what if I read something about a narrative research or a
Mhm.
case study research or phenomenological research, okay, I know what this is now.
Yeah.
Right.
And actually, just real quick, while I say that, one of the articles I read did not, it had a different type of research. It was something transactional theory or something like that. And I thought,
Mm,
well, that's not in the book. This can't be real. No, this isn't legit. So anyway, I found that
mm.
part kind of interesting. So I'm like, well, this wasn't, this is just a different take. So anyway.
All right, let's move into we kind of talked about the audience, and we talked about encoding a little bit. We haven't really talked about quotes, which I think was
Mhm.
interesting. So the quotes, I I think I'm finding it hard to take. I guess no, that's not true. I guess I'm not finding it hard. I am seeing some overlap between quotes and encoding for languages. So for me, um, it was it was one of the things that they stated, and I wish I would have written this down. Shoot, one of the things that they stated in encoding, and I cannot think of the word. It it was similar to vermicelli, and that's how I keep remembering it. But it was talking about how their writing made you feel like the writing was alive and you were there, right? Like that it was real and it was alive and you could picture everything that was going down. And for me, quotes are how I get there. I am a qualitative person. So Chris, you and I are trained very differently. And I've never really been like formally trained as a qualitative person, but I'm a people
Oh,
person.
yeah,
That has been my jam for a long time.
sure.
So, so that part, kind of being able to like picture people, how they're saying things. I can hear the words. So quotes for me are kind of how the storytelling comes alive. So I'm seeing a ton of overlap in that. And both of the Appendix B, which they even stated in the text, used longer quotes to try to um really kind of give a holistic picture, whereas the ethnography was bouncing back between person to person in a group interview. And both of those work for me. All different types of quotes work for me. They always kind of give me that immersive feeling. So I thought that was kind of interesting as I was going through trying to like divide out the different sections for each study. I just kept going back to how this is really connected.
Yeah. And actually for that one, that ethnography, I did enjoy those quotes. And it does. It actually it's a nice break from all of the research speak. It kind of gets down to, okay, here's what we're getting to the point where we're gleaning something out of this. And in the articles I read, uh it was kind of this, I preferred the longer quotes, and that's what they had mostly in there. And the one about the HBCUs, they were actually interviewing administrators from the other HBCUs. So you kind of got a few, sentences in there. Here's what worked. It didn't, you know what I mean? Because you could, it helps knowing, okay, these are people that were leading an institution and they had some discussion and thought behind it. And then the other one I enjoyed because they basically and this was the working adults, if you will, the non-traditionals. He got or that author, I don't even know if it was a he or she, off the top of my head, but they did a kind of diverse students as far as single mothers, different ethnicity, races, different life circumstances, and just kind of showed, it kind of spelled out how much they liked either the online courses or they didn't, or the
Mhm.
challenges that were coming up. So that actually made a lot more impact to me. I mean, I understand the numbers, and as my friend John will say, but there's always a story within the numbers, and there is. Uh,
In here,
and
John saying that.
so it's just nice to do that anyway. But I preferred those quotes.
Mhm.
Very
Just
good.
really kind of like you said, Nicole, kind of brings it to life and brings it down into something tangible rather than this sterile study stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think it grounds it in the participant's experience, right? Like both of the studies that I read, as they were going through the different themes that emerged, they would sort of explain or describe the theme, and then it was like 3 or 4 quotes. It was like, here's why I identified this theme because,
Yep.
so and so said this, so and so said this. It was interesting though, and I'd be curious to know what y'all think about it is so the first study that I read, I would say very traditional. It follows what we read in the book. They studied, I think it was 11, they talked to 11 folks. They were given pseudonyms. And so when they would present a quote, they would say pseudonym name said this, pseudonym name said that. The second study provided no pseudonyms. And so it was just random quotes out there, impactful quotes. I think again, they illustrated what was going on, but I thought it was interesting that they didn't assign any pseudonyms.
So have you done the city training yet?
I am halfway through.
So one of the things that they talked about was the was going back and forth kind of between using pseudonyms and not. So I
Mhm.
wonder if not using pseudonyms gave it an extra level of anonymity. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? Even with the risk of not being able to maybe provide that extra punch of giving like a face to the name or a fa you know what I mean? Like kind of a face to the
Mhm.
quote or that that's interesting because it is very I would need that extra layer of visual. I'd like
Mhm.
to know who's talking so I could kind of
Yeah.
get a better understanding of their lens.
Mhm.
Like, that feels holistic to me. So that's interesting.
Yeah. And admittedly, I'm definitely partial to the first study that I read as far as the way it's laid out. But I did appreciate that. Sort of in the beginning of the study, it gave all the pseudonyms. It gave like what region of the country that they work in, and then what their role is at their institution. And so when we got back to the themes and the quotes, I could go back and say, oh, this person works in the Midwest and they're a vice president of student affairs. That kind of contextualizes things a little bit. Where the second study, they were students at a community college. They have some sort of experience with food insecurity. And so I know that context. But I don't know, it just felt a step removed for me.
Yeah, I see what you're
Uh,
saying. That makes sense to me. Almost like a piece of the identity that you're trying to give voice to is removed, which is the
And
whole
maybe
point,
it's
right?
subconsciously, it's like knowing someone's name humanizes a little bit, even if it's a pseudonym.
Yeah.
I don't know, a
No,
preference thing, but I just thought that was interesting.
it is. It is really interesting, and it kind of gets me thinking about why they might do that. Um, okay. I don't know. So neither one of you read Appendix B. One of the things that I wrote down for Appendix B, just as a kind of a random thought, and I don't mean to take us down a different vein, but for the encoding, one of the things that Appendix B, the author stated was that in a roundabout way, the study was written for women everywhere who were aspiring to elevate. But a cultural there isn't really a way to encode speak for women. Do you know what I mean? What does it mean to be a woman? Right? How do you encode that? So that's one of the interesting things that kind of got me thinking about, how do you when you state that this is what this study is for, how do you make the language for that? There is some language out there that might connect different groups and subgroups and things like that. So maybe that's how you get about it. But that was just one of the trivial things that I had in my mind thinking about encoding and how we use language to speak to different populations and how how complex that could get very quickly.
So, but that was in higher education though, right?
Yes. So it was written for people in higher education.
Right. Okay.
So I would say academia, yes. I just thought the one statement, how they talked about how it's, some I can't even remember which ones they said were very overt. There are some that'll come right out and say, this is what this is who this is written for, blah,
Sure.
blah, blah,
Yep.
right?
Mhm.
Yep.
And so her very clear language was, this is for women who are trying to elevate to the next level, right? Here are some of the things. Here's adversity brings resilience, greater adversity brings greater resilience. I think humans everywhere could understand that, right? But
Sure.
I just,
Yep.
I just, it was just thinking about writing to a culture or writing to a group. How do you try to do that when there's so many different ways to describe that group? You know, a complexity
Yeah.
that I'm not looking for answers here for, but just something that popped into
Oh,
my head as I was reading.
yeah. This is something me and Josh will have figured out here in just a minute. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like
Nicole switching it up on us.
Yeah. Well,
well, no,
what
that's
I
that's definitely interesting. No, you go, Chris. You go.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say the cultures though in higher ed, I'm finding are much different in many ways than out in industry.
Mhm.
And so I and I'm gonna say this because I'm kind of surprised with the industry with some of its focus on things, for example, DEI,
Mhm.
where this even exists. So I'm just, because at least my personal experience working in industry, you didn't have that stuff. You didn't
Mhm.
see it. And so, but as I've learned the industry, higher ed is so steeped in tradition, and you know what I mean? And so, um, I could see where at least the encoding, if you will, might be more impactful for that industry than it would be in some others, I guess.
Sure.
Um,
And the reading did say
so
like if you were, I think it was the gunman case that they said that if you were going to do it towards like a law enforcement focus,
Mhm.
you might put more statistics or law enforcement jargon or things
sure.
like
Yep.
that. So that
Yeah.
that makes sense to me that you would make
Yeah.
adjustments to different groups.
Yeah. So, um, anyway, that's where I could see, especially if I recall, I can't remember if this is somebody she had worked her way up educationally and worked real hard.
Mhm.
So she's kind of a higher ed a success story in higher ed, but yet the culture in and of itself was not supportive of this person actually accomplishing what
Yeah.
you want them to accomplish, right?
Yeah, she
Mhm.
definitely
That I guess that's
definitely
the
made
irony
changes.
I got. And so basically, as I read that, I'm like, you know, at least that's where my head goes. And so, if you read that, it in my mind, it would be more pertinent towards the people that are in that culture, just from the standpoint of, especially in higher ed, they're supposed to be the opposite of that. That's what goes on out there in the cruel world, not here where we're trying to lift people up.
Yet here we are
Well, I
fighting
think
all the
that's sort of the I would say that's what makes that study so impactful, right? Because like you said, we love to put higher ed on a pedestal, the ivory tower. It's so idyllic. And yet,
she has to write about it.
as the researcher has pointed out, there are plenty of experiences of Black women who are experiencing these things that are racist, are sexist, and yet they're navigating and finding success anyway. I think it's
Yep.
interesting. I just pulled it up. Um, but essentially, let's see, the researcher is in the Department of Psychology.
Hmm.
This was originally in the Journal of
Psychology.
Humanistic Psychology. Right. So again, I think it's just coming back to like the wording used is this was written for by a psychologist for an audience of psychologists. Um, to me, that would influence how this is written, and what words are being used and how it's encoded. And there's tons of overlap between psychology and higher ed,
Hmm.
as is right. Like for my dissertation of on-campus food insecurity,
Right.
I'm reading a lot of like the Journal of Human Nutrition, which I never thought I'd read before, or like human nutrition sciences, right? So there's a lot of overlap everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, but as Cresswell and Poff kind of say, like it helps to have this in mind when you start writing. You don't want to get done and write something. You're like, oh shoot, I should have written this for a different audience.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, and I think it makes sense to consider what you're saying. And you've heard that phrase, read the room or think of your audience when you're speaking, right? And if
Mhm.
you're writing for the Journal of Psychology, you might write one thing, but if you're writing for, say, I don't know, the Journal of Nutrition, you might be writing something completely different, right? Like, that wasn't a really good example, but kind of the whole focus of this class has been comparing and contrasting different approaches to study. Same thing for here. If you're taking an approach through a psychological lens, it's going to look one way. If you're taking it through a sociological lens, it's going to look a different way. If you're taking it through a subculture, of a sociological lens, which is, looking at it through racism and classism and sexism, that can take you a whole different route. So I think I don't know, it's just there isn't to all both of your points, there isn't a way to look at it without looking at the other pieces, right? That it's all
Right.
very interwoven and that you can't adjust one piece without doing some impact to the other. So I saw a lot of that in here. As I mentioned with the quotes and encoding, I couldn't really see one without the other.
Mhm.
I can now that we've kind of talked it out. But before, as I was getting in there, I was like, well, how do you speak to your audience without making sure you're picking the right quotes that would make sense so
Yeah.
all of it came together for me in the end.
Well, Nicole, I'm just going to kind of jump back to when you were comparing writing for a nutrition journal versus a psychology. Well, I could see where you could kind of cover that same topic of nutrition or food insecurity or whatever it is from two paths because from a nutritionist standpoint it could show be more maybe technical on the health side of it and
Yep.
things like that and those things, but the psychology side would be um, about the choices those folks, and what their
Mhm.
motivations are for the
How they're
types of
feeling.
food
Yeah,
that they have to do. So, you know, you,
Mhm.
that is, a way to kind of compare and contrast, your audiences on on a similar issue.
hmm
It just might look a little different, you
and no
know?
matter what your lens, and you're looking at things like, as I was reading that, even though I'm not a black woman, I'm still a woman. I've still faced adversity.
Right.
Even though you're
Mhm.
not a woman, either one of you, as far as I know,
Yeah.
you don't identify that way, you've still faced adversity. So you're pulling something from it. So there's always different ways you can pull from the reading. You can always learn something, right?
Yeah.
But just
And
depends.
all these different studies are contributing, right? Like it's all contributing to us better understanding the experience as Black women or or experience of anybody, really, the human experience.
Right.
Uh,
Yep.
I don't know. To me, that's hopeful. It's like all of this is contributing to us, hopefully,
Bigger
being
knowledge.
better,
Yeah.
Yes.
better understanding. Yeah.
Yep.
The
Key point.
that ethnography, I found it fascinating. Just the idea of having when you have the Pakistani, Bangladeshi immigrants. When I was reading it, I'm like, okay. And what I put in my assignment was, from more of a case study or narrative point of view, I'd be curious. I'd want to study the first one, the
Mhm.
grandfather
Grandparents they were
or
talking
the
about.
parent that actually came and immigrated, knowing that they're going to a completely different culture, but yet they went anyway. And kind of how were they accepted? How did they integrate themselves? And how did they
Mhm.
maintain if they chose to their own culture, like a subculture in a Western culture? You know what I mean? And so
Assimilation's a whole other conversation.
and then yeah, I know, but I just so some of these studies kind of go into Josh as far as expanding our horizons. I
Yeah.
never even would have thought of a Bangladeshi and
Food
Pakistani
exploring.
immigrants
Yeah.
going to Britain.
Yeah.
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 It just well, why would you do that? So,
You're
uh,
contributing to a whole pool of knowledge.
yeah. And of course, over time you would see because then you have a culture clash, if you will, and how do the cultures survive with one another?
Mm-hmm.
And because it could be applied that, as I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, this could apply. What if we were to move to Syria? I'm just throwing a note, where you have such a contrast in culture. Um, what would it be like to live, to maintain our own culture over there? It just, I don't know.
somebody would
Yeah.
do a study
Sorry, I
on
know
it,
we're getting
let
off
us
the
know.
track here, but
Say, Chris, that sounds like a great opportunity for a dissertation. I think it's right there.
Group project.
yeah, well, I like my numbers. But no, I do like to think about that stuff because it's okay, well, what would it
Yeah.
be like,
Yeah.
So because I think the human experience would be similar. It just depends on who the majority, who the minority, uh, what's
Hmm.
the majority culture, what's the minority, I
Hmm.
think humans in general are going to behave similarly, no matter how the roles are, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
So that's all. But anyway, I know we're getting off track. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I think we've covered everything. Does anybody else have anything to add? I think we covered all four.
I
I
think
feel good
so.
about it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, great discussion, y'all. It's great
Yeah.
because I don't think we've had a discussion yet together, have we? No.
Nope. Well, I think I may have been one with Josh at some point. Not this class though.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. But we haven't had too many opportunities other than this class to do these these discussion things. So this has been cool.
I like this as an option.
I do
Yeah.
too. I
I
do
do
too,
like being able to do it the old-fashioned way if we
if I need
needed
to.
Hmm.
to.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but I
um,
probably won't do that again. That was just bad planning on my part.
well, when you have family issues come up, it was like, oh, I really have to these 2 weeks are going to be
Yeah.
really ugly, so I gotta
Hmm.
pace things out. But
Yeah.
we're almost done with this one. I
Yeah.
mean, really?
Next week.
Yeah, it's wild.
Week 7.
Yeah. And I
And then
already
we'll be
did
done
the
with our
city
first year.
thing, so
Our whole first year.
Wow.
we'll have our E.
Yes, that's my favorite thing to tell people. And I make sure I give
Mm.
you credit too, Chris, because it's so funny.
One down, two to go. It has flown,
Yeah.
Hmm.
as we're talking about that, it's like when I tell, younger people, oh, or my kids, you go to school, oh, it'll take forever. I'm like, it goes fast.
And you're
And
going through
it's
life
like,
anyway. Might as well do it.
yeah.
Yeah,
And you'll be looking at it in the rearview mirror before you know it.
that's right.
So, anyway,
All
it's
right,
quite an
y'all.
adventure though.
Yeah. I will do a little bit of editing and then I will post. If for some
Okay.
reason I cannot do this, Josh, I'll make sure that I get in touch with you so we can get it uploaded.
Yeah, just let me know.
All right,
And
y'all.
then I think we just need to once it's up there, post our references underneath there.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, I probably will too because I did D&E, so yeah, I will too.
Yeah,
We'll just
you
kind of,
probably just do the text.
yeah,
I just do like if I did that, I'd probably just do one for the text.
that's probably what I'll do. Yeah.
I just have to copy them off the ones I submitted before for the other text. I've done
There you go. Find it right away.
that.
Mm.
Well,
Oh,
guys, it's great seeing you again. I love catching up. So,
yeah, you
Yeah,
too, Chris.
likewise.
All right, we'll talk soon.
yep,
All
take care
right,
of
bye, y'all.
yourselves now.
Bye, y'all.
See ya.